The morning after the terror arrived with a silence more profound, more chilling than any earthly sound. It clung to the air like the mist that rose from the frigid earth, obscuring the full ghastliness of the scene yet hinting at defilements that lay just beyond the veil. The sun, a pallid disk struggling against the oppressive gray, cast weak, diffuse light upon a tableau of utter ruin. This was no mere raid, no act of human or even conventional predatory violence. This was a blight, an abomination visited upon the small settlement nestled at the very edge of the great woods. Roofs were not merely damaged. They were rent asunder, timbers splintered and twisted by a colossal, careless hand. Carts lay overturned, their wheels wrenched free, spokes snapped like dry twigs. But the true horror lay not in the inanimate destruction, but in the grotesque evidence of life extinguished and violated. Livestock, the lifeblood of the village, lay scattered and mangled, their forms twisted into impossible shapes. Organs spilled upon the frozen ground in dark, glistening pools. Even in this carnage, a strange, unsettling lack of totality was evident. The creatures had culled rather than simply killed, taking specific, dreadful portions while leaving the rest in a state of vile disarray. Patches of dark, viscous blood stained the churned mud and remaining patches of late snow, the scent of iron and death thick and nauseating in the still air. An atmosphere of unimaginable fear and profound shock gripped the survivors. They huddled together, their faces ashen, eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the incomprehensible void that had swallowed their sense of security. Whispers, dry and ragged, passed between them. They spoke not of brave resistance or plans for vengeance, but of a deep, primordial dread that recounted forces far beyond their comprehension. Children clung to their mothers, their small faces buried in skirts, mercifully shielded from the worst of the sight, yet absorbing the pervasive terror that permeated the very air. The usual sounds of village life, the lowing of cattle, the distant clang of a hammer, the cheerful shouts of children, were absent, replaced by a suffocating quiet, broken only by the ragged breaths of the living and the faint, mournful sigh of the wind through shattered eaves. Amidst this desolation, the traces left behind were the most disturbing element of all. On the wet snow and slick, dark mud, monstrous footprints were clearly visible. They were unmistakably those of a wolf, yet of a size that defied belief, larger than the paws of the mightiest timber wolves known to these lands, larger even than the prints left by the legendary fearsome beasts of the deepest wilds. They were deep, heavy impressions, showing immense weight, and they followed a clear, purposeful path leading directly from the heart of the devastation towards the brooding, impenetrable wall of the great woods. Then, the impossible occurred. At the very edge of the tree line, where the last of the snow met the dark, leaf-strewn earth of the forest floor, the tracks simply ceased. They did not fade, did not lead into a leap or a scramble, did not continue onto a less yielding surface. They ended abruptly, as if the creature had simply dissolved into the frigid air. There were no human footprints entering the woods, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle carried into the dense undergrowth. Only the colossal wolf prints, reaching the forest boundary, and then nothing. Among the first to arrive from the surrounding, less affected homesteads was Stig, a man known for his uncanny ability to read the land, a tracker whose skills were legendary among the hunters of the region. His usual keen gaze, capable of discerning the faintest sign of passage, was clouded with confusion as he knelt by the final terminating print. He ran a gloved hand over the impression, tracing its impossible end. His skills, honed over decades of pursuing beast and man through these unforgiving landscapes, were useless here. The signs defied natural law, mocked his expertise. He rose slowly, shaking his head, a faint, unnerving line appearing between his brows. The natural world had rules. These tracks showed those rules had been broken. The elder of the village, Helgi, a man whose face bore the deep lines of age and hardship, but was now etched with a fresh, paralyzing fear, stood trembling. His voice, usually steady and commanding, was reedy and broken as he recited the names of the vanished. 4 souls were gone without a trace into the maw of the night. They were not warriors, not men trained in combat or survival. A simple farmer, a woman with her child, an old man. Their disappearance, lacking any evidence of struggle or being physically dragged away, save for those impossible paw prints, led the survivors to a single, terrifying conclusion. They had been taken. They were not killed in place, but carried off, spirited away by whatever monstrous force had wrought this destruction. In the wake of this profound mystery, gripped by a panic that threatened to overwhelm them, the villagers whispered of the dire tribe, resurrecting old legends previously relegated to the realm of children's stories and hearthside tales told on long, dark nights. They spoke of ancient attacks in a distant past, of creatures that shed their human skin, of beings that stole not just life, but the very essence of the soul. Kettle, a man who had once been a respected warrior, bore the most obvious signs of this burgeoning superstitious dread. His eyes darted nervously towards the dark edge of the woods, his hand instinctively gripping the haft of the axe strapped to his belt, his face a mask of fear that shamed his former bravery. He had faced human enemies, even great bears, but the whispers recounted something else entirely. Helgi, understanding with a chilling certainty that conventional warriors, the strength of their axes and shields, were helpless against such an adversary, made a difficult, fateful decision. He sent for the great game hunters, those men and women who lived on the fringe of civilization and the wild, whose knowledge of the great woods surpassed that of any villager or ordinary warrior. They were sought out for the most dangerous quarry, for beasts that preyed on men, for challenges that required cunning and a deep, almost primal understanding of the hunt. He believed, with a desperate hope that warred with his profound fear, that only they could track this game. And so, they came. Einar arrived first, a man whose presence exuded a quiet competence, followed by a few of his people. His composure and the stillness in his bearing contrasted sharply with the abject panic that permeated the village. He listened intently as Helgi recounted the horror, describing the devastation and pointing towards the unnerving end of the tracks at the forest's edge. Einar's eyes, keen and assessing, showed no fear, but a deep, cold wariness settled upon them as he absorbed the details. He knelt by the tracks, studying them with a concentration that mirrored Stig's earlier efforts. Yet his silence held a weight that indicated a dawning, terrible understanding. Einar made his decision swiftly, recognizing the peculiar nature of the task. He assembled a small, hand-picked company of 6 for this unnatural hunt. The chosen were Bjorn, a man of immense physical strength and unparalleled skill with traps; Stig, the renowned tracker whose earlier confusion was now mixed with a determined, though apprehensive, focus. Soulwag, a woman whose connection to the land and its hidden lore was as deep as the roots of the ancient trees. Catil, the former warrior whose fear was a tangible thing, but whose knowledge of the woods was still valuable. And Torsten, a younger man, eager but untested against such a foe. They were briefed on their objective: to track the thing responsible for the attack and disappearances into the great woods, and to eliminate the threat. The atmosphere within the assembled group was a complex mixture of professional readiness, a shared skepticism towards the villagers' wilder tales, and a profound, gnawing unease about the impossible evidence that lay before them. The hunt had begun, but it was a hunt unlike any they had known. As the small company gathered, the distinct natures of its members became evident, each reflecting a different facet of the skills and limitations they brought to this unprecedented undertaking. Einar stood at the center, his bearing calm and measured, a quiet pool of deliberate action amidst the lingering tremor of the village's fear. He was the leader, not by shouted command, but by the sheer weight of his experience and the unwavering focus in his gaze. Bjorn, thick-muscled and broad-shouldered, projected an air of solid confidence, his large hands already running over the tools of his trade, ropes, stakes, the intricate mechanisms of snares and triggers. He trusted in the tangible, in the laws of physics that governed weight and tension, leverage and force. Stig, lean and sharp-eyed, pored over a roughly drawn map of the territory, his analytical mind already dissecting terrain and potential routes. He spoke of large predators, of reclusive bands of hostile men, his voice carrying a faint intellectual amusement at the mention of myths. He was a man whose faith rested solely on empirical evidence and the cold logic of the wild. Soulwag remained apart, a figure of quiet intensity. Her eyes, dark and knowing, scanned the ravaged site and the forest's edge. She was a woman of few words, her focus turned inward or perhaps toward something unseen, her fingers absently toying with the small leather pouches that contained her herbs and potent earthy concoctions. Kettle stood a little behind the others, his grip on his heavy axe white-knuckled. His gaze shifted nervously, flitting between the gruesome remains of the livestock and the oppressive darkness beneath the trees. He visibly wrestled with a deep, visceral fear, a fear that emanated not just from the violence, but from the source of it. Torsten, the youngest, shifted restlessly, a restless energy in his movements. His face, while showing signs of the general unease, still held a spark of youthful impatience, an eagerness for the thrill of the hunt that this grim scene could not entirely extinguish. Einar laid out the task with precise clarity, his voice low but carrying authority. "We follow the signs," he stated, gesturing towards the abruptly ending tracks. "We determine their direction, locate their lair, and eliminate the threat." He emphasized that the trail led into the great woods, into its most savage, least explored depths territories, known only through cautionary tales and the rare, unreliable accounts of those who had ventured too far and returned, altered. Stig, ever the rationalist, offered his assessment. "A pack of exceptionally large wolves," he stated, his voice dry, or a group of men driven to savagery using animal skins for concealment. He dismissed the villagers' talk of shapeshifters and spirits with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Superstition dies hard," he murmured, his gaze returning to the map. But Soulwag, who had been walking slowly around the perimeter of the devastation, knelt by the ripped remains of a cow. She didn't just look. She touched, her fingers tracing the unnatural lines of the wounds, feeling the texture of the frozen blood and the defiled earth. A shiver passed through her. It was not just the cold of the ground she felt, but something else. A profound wrongness, a distortion that went beyond mere death and decay. She rose and walked towards the trees, her eyes searching the trunks. On the rough bark of an ancient oak, half hidden by a cluster of dark, clinging moss, she found a mark. It was faint, barely visible, yet she recognized it instantly. It was not a natural abrasion, not the marking of a deer or the scratch of a bird's claw. It was a symbol, crude yet deliberate, composed of intersecting lines and curves that writhed and coiled within themselves. Soulwag knew these marks. They were old, tied to the forgotten tongue of the deep woods, symbols whispered in legends of forest spirits, of boundaries crossed, of transformation and the blurring of forms. Her quiet unease deepened into a cold certainty. This was not just a beast. The hunters set about preparing their gear, each assembling the tools of their specialized craft. Einar checked the tension on his longbow, his quiver filled with carefully fletched arrows, the small, sharp axe at his belt a last resort. Bjorn meticulously coiled his heavy ropes, sharpened the point of his massive spear, and gathered his tools for setting snares and digging pits. Solid, practical instruments designed to counter weight and movement. Stig selected his lighter bow and razor-sharp knife, securing pouches containing finely ground powders meant to enhance vision and scent, aids for a tracker who relied on the subtle clues of the natural world. Soulwag arranged her basket, filling it with bundles of dried herbs, small clay jars of potent salves and viscous liquids, and an assortment of carved talismans, not for protection against physical blows, but against influences less tangible. Kettle and Torsten, the designated guards and force, hefted their battle axes and checked the balance of their lighter-throwing spears. Their equipment was designed for conventional combat, for confronting known threats, not for the spectral horrors recounted by terrified villagers. It became starkly clear that their preparations, formidable as they were against earthly foes, were tragically inadequate for the nature of this hunt. Einar assigned their roles, his voice steady. "Stig, you take the lead. You find the path they took." Stig nodded, the professional overriding his earlier bewilderment. "Bjorn, you are our engineer. Camp fortifications, traps if the opportunity arises." Bjorn nodded, his confidence returning now that tangible tasks were presented. "Soulwag, you are our eyes and our healer, but more. Your understanding of the forest goes deeper than ours." Soulwag's silent acknowledgement was a simple, knowing glance. "Catil, Torsten, you are our guard, our strength. You watch our backs." Catil's hand tightened on his axe. Torsten straightened, a flicker of his youthful eagerness returning. Einar would coordinate, make the final decisions, the burden of command heavy upon him. The moment of departure was charged with quiet emotion. The surviving villagers stood watching, their faces a mixture of desperate hope and profound fear. They looked upon these hunters, their last hope, as they passed through the ravaged settlement towards the dark, waiting woods. The contrast was stark. The open sky and visible fear of the village versus the dense canopy and focused intensity of the departing group. As they crossed the threshold into the great woods, the air shifted. The faint sounds of the village faded entirely, replaced by a silence that felt unnatural, heavy, as if the forest itself held its breath. Stig found the tracks again at the edge, the same colossal wolf prints pressing into the damp earth. He began to move, slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning every detail. The depth of the print, the disturbance of a fallen leaf, the angle of a broken twig. Einar followed close behind, his gaze fixed on Stig's back, trust and concern warring in his expression. The others followed, their footsteps muffled by the thick duff of the forest floor. The dense air of the woods pressed in on them, cold and heavy. The hunt had truly begun, leading them not into the familiar challenges of the wild, but towards an unknown, terrifying communion with something ancient and deeply wrong. The hunters moved through the great woods with the practiced fluidity of those who had spent their lives reading its complex language. They understood the subtle shifts in the wind that spoke of approaching weather, the patterns of animal trails that revealed the movements of prey and predator, the type of soil that dictated where water would collect. The forest was, in a sense, a living entity to them, its rhythms and signs a familiar text. But with every step deeper into its embrace, the grammar of that text subtly changed. The trees rose higher, their trunks thicker and more ancient, forming a canopy so dense that the meager light of day struggled to penetrate, casting the forest floor in perpetual somber twilight. The air grew stiller, heavier, and the silence, once merely the absence of human sound, now felt profound, unnatural. The familiar calls of birds were strangely absent, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth minimal, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Stig continued to lead, his focus absolute as he followed the monstrous tracks. The prints of the colossal wolf were clearer here, pressed into the damp earth, each claw mark distinct, each pad defined. Yet the longer he studied them, the more unsettling the subtle anatomical incorrectness became apparent. They were impossibly large for any known wolf. Yes, but there was something else. A distribution of weight, an angle of impact that didn't quite align with the gait of a four-legged creature. At times, the prints were deeper than they should have been for a single animal, showing the weight of something with a more upright posture. A vague disquiet gnawed at the edges of Stig's analytical mind, a sense that the very form of the creature was fluid, unnatural. Then, for the first time deep within the woods, the prints vanished again. Not near the edge, not at a rocky outcrop or across a swift stream, but in the middle of a relatively clear glade. They simply ceased. The hunters spread out, searching the immediate vicinity. There were no thickets large enough to conceal a creature of that size, no boulders for it to have climbed, no evidence of a leap or a sudden upward propulsion. The entity simply stepped out of existence. This abrupt termination, seen now in the heart of the wilderness, brought the first serious wave of confusion and fear to the entire group. Even the pragmatic Stig, his face tight with bewildered frustration, had no rational explanation. As they pressed on, a new element assailed their senses. Strange odors permeated the air, not the familiar scent of wild animals or decaying leaves or damp earth. This was a complex, foul aroma, a disturbing blend of wet fur and something else. Something acrid and metallic, like stale blood mixed with raw, disturbed earth. underscored by a cloying sweetness that hinted at decay. But a decay that was somehow wrong. It was a smell that clung to the very fabric of the air, cold and unnerving. Alongside the smells came peculiar sounds. Not the howling of a wolf, though that would have been terrifying enough. These were distant, drawn-out sounds, moans or perhaps cries that echoed through the dense trees, distorted and muffled, yet bearing a disturbing resemblance to the sound of a human voice twisted in agony or despair. The sounds came from nowhere specific, a disembodied chorus of sorrow and terror. Bjorn, ever the pragmatist, acted on the assumption of a large, albeit unusual, beast. He identified a narrow passage along the likely path of the creature and set a large pit trap, disguising it with meticulous care, weaving branches and leaves over the concealed opening. He was confident. Nothing of that size could pass unseen or avoid such a carefully laid snare. But when they checked it later, anticipation turning to apprehension, the pit was undisturbed. The cover remained perfectly intact. Yet the monstrous tracks clearly led directly towards it and then, inexplicably, veered sharply to bypass it at the last moment, continuing on the other side as if the creature had known precisely where the danger lay. This blatant avoidance of a perfectly camouflaged trap deeply rattled Bjorn, undermining his absolute faith in his primary skill. Soulwag, relying on her different kind of knowledge, had set her own small, almost invisible snares and tripwires near the path, crafted from sinew and woven plant fibers, sensitive to the slightest touch. The next day, she found them not sprung, but violently torn apart, shredded with a strength that was impossible for mere animal claws. The small branches she had attached them to were snapped cleanly, or in some cases, ripped entirely from the ground, leaving gouges in the earth. She knelt, examining the damage, her face somber. This was not the clumsy blundering of a beast. This was the deliberate, destructive act of something that understood such simple constraints and possessed the unnatural power to overcome them effortlessly. Her deepening unease was confirmed when she paused by an ancient, gnarled tree whose branches twisted like tormented limbs against the dim sky. On its weathered bark, at a height no natural animal could reach with casual ease, she found deep scratches. They were undoubtedly the marks of enormous claws, yet like the footprints, they weren't random. They were arranged in a specific pattern, forming crude, primitive symbols. Soulwag recognized them as echoes of the ancient, almost forgotten marks she had seen earlier, but here they were more numerous, more deliberately arranged, seeming to form a sequence or a message. These were the signs of the deep woods, linked in lore to points of passage, to boundaries between worlds, to rituals of transformation. Her anxiety, already a cold weight in her gut, escalated sharply. They were no longer hunting a beast. They were following the trail of something that left intelligent, ritualistic marks, something that understood their methods and circumvented them with uncanny ease. The woods around them pressed closer, the silence more absolute, imbued with a lurking malevolence that turned every rustle of leaves into a potential threat. As the company plunged deeper into the great woods, the oppressive atmosphere thickened, pressing in on them not just physically, but mentally. The feeling of being watched, which had been a vague unease at the forest's edge, intensified with every mile. This was not merely the instinctive sense of a hunter that he is in the presence of dangerous game. This was the distinct, chilling awareness of a cold, intelligent gaze fixed upon them from the surrounding darkness. Every snapping twig that wasn't their own footfall, every flicker of movement at the periphery of their vision, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their bodies, muscles tensing, hands tightening on weapons. The woods were no longer just a hunting ground. They were an arena, and they were the unwitting performers in a terrible, unseen spectacle. The forest itself became an active participant in their torment, twisting and shifting in subtle, menacing ways. Patches of sudden, inexplicable fog swirled amongst the trees, thick and disorienting. Small streams they expected to find flowing were strangely frozen over. The water solid beneath a thin sheet of ice despite the relatively mild air temperature. Ancient trees, their forms already distorted by time and the harsh environment, took on new, terrifying shapes in the dim light of dusk and dawn, appearing like hunched figures, gaping maws or skeletal hands reaching from the shadows. Nature itself was reacting to the presence of the dire tribe, or perhaps to their intrusion into these forbidden domains, becoming hostile, warping reality around them. Kettle, already teetering on the edge of profound fear, finally succumbed to the pressure. Under the oppressive weight of the forest's gaze and the unsettling anomalies, he recounted the grim, ancient stories of the dire tribe that he had heard as a child. His voice, hushed and ragged, filled the tense silence of their sparse campfires. He spoke of children stolen from their cradles, of men and women who had ventured into these woods and returned but not whole, their minds broken, their bodies subtly but terribly changed. He whispered of curses passed down through bloodlines, of pacts made with entities older and darker than the land itself. His tales filled with vivid, terrifying details and delivered with the conviction of a man who believed them implicitly, acted like a poison on the already frayed nerves of the group, amplifying the pervasive sense of dread. Even Einar, whose years of facing danger had forged an almost unbreakable resolve, felt the unsettling tendrils of doubt creep into his mind. His instincts, honed over countless hunts, screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. All his knowledge of animal behavior, of tracking, of the rules of the wild, proved useless against this invisible, elusive adversary. He understood with a dawning, cold certainty that they were confronting something that simply did not fit within the framework of his known world, something that mocked his experience and rendered his skills inadequate. The tension within the group became a palpable entity, a coiled serpent ready to strike. Stig, his face drawn and pale beneath his tan, grew increasingly irritable. His failure to logically explain the tracks and their sudden disappearances chipped away at his self-assurance, leaving him raw and defensive. Bjorn, the bedrock of their physical strength and practical skills, was consumed by a quiet fury that his carefully constructed traps had been so easily bypassed, his faith in the tangible laws of the world shaken. Kettle's panic escalated, manifesting in sudden outbursts of terror, sometimes crying out in the dead of night, wrenched from sleep by nightmares that leaked from the very air around them. Torsten's youthful bravado had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a wide-eyed fear that he struggled, poorly, to conceal. Only Einar and Soulwag maintained an outward semblance of calm, though the deep lines of worry around Einar's eyes and the somber intensity of Soulwag's gaze betrayed their profound disquiet. Adding to their isolation and growing dread came news from messengers dispatched from distant settlements relayed by a lone trapper they encountered near a stream. The attacks had not been confined to Helgi's village. Similar incidents marked by the same inexplicable disappearances and those monstrous unnatural tracks had occurred in other remote locations, often with similar horrifying circumstances. This confirmed their worst fears. They were not dealing with a lone rogue beast or a small band of renegades. This was a larger force, a shifting, moving group, and the hunt had, unbeknownst to them until now, shifted its focus. They were no longer solely the hunters. They were also the hunted. They made camp under a sky that offered no solace, the stars obscured by the thick canopy. Sleep was impossible. Strange sounds, whispers in a language that echoed without source, the unnatural snap of twigs that suggested movement too large and too close, a distant, muffled howl that did not sound quite like a wolf, all surrounded them, pressing in from the unseen darkness. They felt utterly besieged by an invisible enemy, their small circle of firelight a fragile barrier against the encroaching blackness and the things that lurked within it. Each hunter gripped their weapon tightly, their senses strained, listening to the sounds of the forest, now imbued with a terrifying, malevolent intelligence. The morning found Stig looking gaunt, his eyes sunken, the lines of fatigue etched deep around his mouth. Yet, the instinct of the tracker, though battered by the inexplicable, compelled him forward. The tracks had reappeared with the dawn, still bearing their subtle, unsettling anomalies, but now they led with unnerving purpose towards the most inhospitable and untamed regions of the great woods, areas where the fjords clawed deepest into the land, where the mountains rose stark and forbidding, places where the people of the settlements rarely, if ever, dared to venture. Stig followed them almost automatically, a cold certainty settling upon him that these trails were leading them towards something significant, something ancient and terrible. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, mirroring the escalating danger of their quest. Steep, rocky ascents challenged their endurance, requiring them to scramble and climb. Perilous ravines sliced through the landscape, forcing them to seek precarious detours. Low-lying areas turned into treacherous bogs, sucking at their boots, threatening to trap them in their cold, muddy embrace. The hunters relied on their collective experience to navigate these obstacles. Bjorn used his strength to secure ropes for the climbs. Catil, despite his fear, proved steady and reliable when assisting with descents. Einar, ever watchful, guided them through the safest passages. This was a testament to their combined skills in survival, yet the constant struggle against the land itself felt less like a natural challenge and more like an active resistance. Soulwag observed their passage with a deepening sense of recognition and dread. They were entering places spoken of only in the most ancient legends, lands said to be inhabited by spirits, by beings that belonged to neither the human world nor the realm of natural beasts. These were the territories the people of the settlements had instinctually avoided for generations, areas marked by a palpable sense of taboo. The air here felt different, heavier, colder, carrying a faint, earthy scent that was both unfamiliar and unsettling. The vegetation was subtly wrong, plants with unnatural colors, trees with grotesque growths, stones covered in strange, iridescent mosses that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The very land felt alien, charged with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. It was not just the natural terrain that hindered them. The forest itself set its own subtle traps. Sudden, unexpected rockfalls occurred on the slopes above them. Narrow paths they intended to follow were mysteriously blocked by recently fallen trees, often showing signs of having been snapped or twisted with immense unnatural force. Unmarked gullies and sinkholes appeared unexpectedly in their path. These were not random acts of nature. The environment itself was actively hindering their progress, acting in concert with the unseen entities that stalked them. The mystery of the tracks deepened with each passing day. They continued to exhibit their disturbing anomalies. Sometimes the colossal wolf prints inexplicably alternated with the tracks of bare human feet, equally large and heavy. At other times, the tracks appeared on sheer rock faces where no creature of that weight and form could climb or traverse. Stig, despite his exhaustion, continued to pore over them, his brow furrowed in concentration, trying desperately to find a logical explanation, a pattern that fit the known laws of the natural world. He found none. Einar watched his chief trackers struggle with growing concern, recognizing the signs of a mind pushed to its limits of comprehension. Kettle's fear, no longer contained, manifested in terrifying visions and increasingly erratic behavior. He saw fleeting shadows at the edge of his vision, figures that melted away when he turned his head. The wind whispering through the trees no longer sounded like the natural movement of air, but like a chorus of voices, sometimes indistinct, sometimes hissing his name. His old wound, a jagged scar across his chest from a past battle, ached with a new, unfamiliar pain, as if the physical trauma had opened him to a deeper, more ancient horror that affected not just the body but the very core of the mind. He spoke frequently, his voice trembling, of spirits, of ancient curses, of vengeful gods stirring in their slumber. After days of punishing travel, struggling against both the land and their own mounting fear, the company reached the outer limit of the great woods in this direction. Before them lay a vista of even wilder, more mountainous terrain, a desolate landscape of rock and scree. But the tracks did not lead out into this open desolation. Instead, they veered sharply towards a sheer cliff face. Upon closer inspection, obscured by dense, overhanging vines and a cluster of wind-scoured pines, they discovered a hidden fissure, a narrow gorge slicing into the rock. The entrance was almost imperceptible, masked by natural barriers. The tracks, however, led into it with unwavering certainty. This place felt like a boundary, a threshold between the world they knew and something else entirely. It was the end of the trail, and the beginning of something far more terrifying. With extreme caution, the company entered the narrow fissure, the hidden gorge that led into the heart of the forgotten valley. The entrance, cunningly concealed by natural rock formations and thick, tangled vegetation, closed behind them, severing their connection to the world outside. Inside, the air was utterly still, heavy and stagnant, devoid of the slightest breeze. The silence was absolute, a profound, unnatural stillness that swallowed even the sounds of their own breathing. The light that filtered down from the narrow strip of sky visible far above was dim and diffused, taking on a strange greenish-gray hue that leached the color from everything it touched. The valley floor was choked with ancient trees whose forms were even more twisted and grotesque than those in the outer woods, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. This place felt forgotten by time, a pocket of primeval darkness preserved within the unforgiving landscape. As they advanced, the hunters discovered signs that were utterly alien to a natural animal lair. Scattered amongst the rocks and tangled roots were crudely shaped stones, some piled upon others in ways that showed the remnants of primitive structures, broken walls or collapsed shelters. There were patches of blackened earth, the residue of ancient fires that had burned long ago. Lying in the dirt were fragments of primitive tools, crudely fashioned from bone or sharp flakes of stone. Implements not designed for hunting or butchering in the way they understood it, but for purposes they could not immediately discern. This was not simply a den, it was a place of habitation, showing a deeper, more complex form of existence than that of mere beasts. Further in, the evidence of intelligent, deliberate activity became more undeniable and more disturbing. They found rough figures carved from wood and bone, crude idols depicting forms that were unsettlingly unnatural, half human, half animal shapes, their features distorted, their limbs twisted into impossible poses. On scattered stones and within shallow alcoves in the rock walls, they found the same strange symbols Soulwag had seen earlier, but here they were more numerous, arranged in patterns that showed a deliberate design, a sanctuary, a place of dark worship. Soulwag, her face pale, confirmed her earlier suspicions. These were undoubtedly linked to ancient dark rituals, to practices long forbidden and forgotten by those who lived in the light of civilization. And then came the discoveries that struck the deepest, most agonizing blow. Scattered among the refuse, mixed with discarded animal bones and other unrecognizable detritus, they found unmistakable proof connected to the vanished villagers. A torn piece of fabric from a familiar tunic, a broken wooden comb, its teeth snapped, a small mud-stained child's boot, its leather worn soft. Stig, his voice barely a whisper, pointed to dark, viscous stains on the ground near the artifacts. Human blood, he stated. The simple words carrying the weight of a terrible truth. This was the irrefutable evidence, confirming the horrifying connection between the creatures of this place and the lost souls from the village. The hunters finally grasped the true nature of their enemy, and the realization was a cold, sickening plunge into a deeper abyss of horror. These were not merely monstrous predators, not simply degenerate savages. They were a tribe, a community of beings who were either fundamentally human or who had been inextricably linked to humanity through a curse, a horrific transformation, or an ancient unholy pact. The horror they now faced was no longer the straightforward fear of being preyed upon by a powerful beast. It was a horror rooted in the perversion of the natural order, in a twisted, unnatural existence that blurred the lines between man and animal in a deeply disturbing way. Soulwag, her gaze fixed on the arrangement of marked stones and the crude idols, voiced her certainty. "This is not just a lair," she murmured, her voice low and intense. "It is an ancient place, a shrine, a sanctuary." She stated that it was here that the rituals occurred, rituals connected to the transformation, to the pact with the dark forces that had inflicted this curse. This explained why the place was so cunningly hidden, why the creatures were so bound to it. It was the source, the core of their unnatural existence. The terrible truth settled upon the company with crushing weight. By entering the lair, they had walked directly into a trap. They were now on enemy territory within the most sacred, most protected heart of the dire tribe's domain. The pervasive sense of being watched intensified, becoming physically palpable, as if the very stones and trees of the valley held unseen eyes. The sun, which had seemed so weak and distant above, dipped below the rim of the gorge, plunging the valley floor into deep, ominous shadows. Einar, his face grim, made the only decision left to them. They could not retreat now without being hunted down in the open. They were trapped. They would remain in the valley and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The hunt had ended, and the battle for their lives against a foe more terrible than they could have ever imagined was about to begin. Einar surveyed the hidden valley, his eyes moving constantly, assessing the terrain. He chose a location for their camp, a small, defensible rise within the gorge, offering a limited view of the surrounding area, but protected on several sides by sheer rock faces. Bjorn, despite the earlier blow to his confidence, immediately fortified the position with grim efficiency, using fallen branches and loose stones to create a rudimentary barrier, a fragile line of defense against an enemy whose capabilities were still largely unknown. They were preparing for an attack, but now with the chilling knowledge that their adversary was not a mindless beast, but something twisted and unnatural, possessing a terrible intelligence. Gathered in their small, increasingly tense circle, the hunters spoke in low tones about what they had seen, attempting to grapple with the incomprehensible reality they had uncovered. Stig, his analytical mind reeling, struggled to articulate how such transformations were possible, how the laws of flesh and bone were so utterly defied. Bjorn spoke, his voice rough, of the unnatural strength required to rend steel and shatter wood with such ease, a power that went far beyond that of any animal he had ever encountered. Kettle, his face a mask of terror and morbid fascination, muttered incessantly about demons, about ancient curses, about the wrath of forgotten gods punishing transgressions too terrible to name. Soulwag, her voice calm but resonant with a profound ancient knowledge, spoke of forbidden magic, of the fragile boundary between the world of men and the realm of beasts, a boundary that here, in this accursed valley, had been erased through some terrible transformative act. Despite the profound horror of their discovery, a core of professional resolve remained within the hunters. They were individuals who had survived countless deadly encounters with the wild, whose lives had been forged in the crucible of danger. The fear was a cold, constant companion now, but it was tempered by a steely determination to face the threat head-on. They understood with a clarity born of desperation that there was no escape. They were deep within enemy territory, trapped in a place that was both lair and unholy sanctuary. They would either confront this horror and destroy it, or they would perish here, becoming yet more forgotten victims in this valley of shadows. Soulwag, sensing the encroaching darkness, both literal and metaphorical, began her own preparations. She spread out her collection of herbs and talismans, the tools of her esoteric craft. With deliberate movements, she created protective wards, drawing on ancient knowledge of the land and its unseen forces. She sought out specific plants within the valley, identifying those rumored in lore to have properties that could ward against or weaken creatures of transformation. Substances said to disrupt the connection between the human and animal realms, to repel the unnatural forces that bound these beings. Her actions, grounded in practices that predated the memory of the settlements, felt both strangely effective and utterly inadequate against the magnitude of the evil they faced. Night descended upon the hidden valley like a heavy shroud, plunging the gorge into absolute darkness, save for the faint, ghostly light of the distant stars visible above. The small circle of their campfire felt pathetically small, a flickering defiance against the encroaching void. The camp settled into a strained, tense silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the ragged breaths of the waiting hunters. Every rustle of leaves, every faint sound from the surrounding darkness was magnified, interpreted by their hypersensitive ears as a prelude to the attack. They took turns on watch, huddled near the fire, but true rest was impossible. Paranoia, a cold, insidious presence, had reached its peak. Catil, his eyes wide and staring, reported seeing fleeting spectral figures moving just beyond the firelight, convinced the valley was teeming with vengeful spirits. They conducted a final, nervous check of their equipment. Axes were sharpened to a razor's edge, bowstrings tested for tension, quivers filled with arrows. Soulwag had prepared a potent dark liquid, smearing it onto the tips of some arrows and the edges of knives. A poison derived from toxic plants known for their effect on the nervous system. A desperate hope that earthly toxins would have some impact on an unnatural foe. They knew deep down that their conventional weapons would prove terribly ineffective against such creatures, but it was all they had. Soulwag, her eyes closed for a moment, seemed to be listening not with her ears, but with some deeper sense. She froze, her body rigid. When she opened her eyes, they were wide with alarm. "They are close," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. She felt the perimeter around the camp tightening, an unseen pressure pressing in from all sides. The air grew colder. The foul, animalistic odors they had encountered earlier intensified, thick and cloying. The feeling of being watched was now overwhelming, an almost tangible weight. The creatures were here. The battle was inevitable. The attack, when it came, was not a slow creep or a tentative probe. It was sudden, ferocious, erupting from multiple directions simultaneously. The creatures utilized the dense cover of the twisted trees and the deep shadows of the gorge with chilling effectiveness, moving with an unnatural silence that belied their size, appearing abruptly where the hunters least expected them. This was not the chaotic charge of wild animals driven by hunger or instinct. It was a coordinated assault, a carefully executed ambush by beings possessing a predatory cunning that mirrored human intelligence, amplified by a bestial ferocity. The first wave struck with terrifying speed and power. Their forms, glimpsed in the flickering firelight and the dim starlight, were monstrous, immense muscular figures covered in dark matted fur. Some possessed distinctly wolf-like heads, their maws gaping to reveal rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. Others had faces caught in a horrifying transition, features distorted into a grotesque, bestial semblance of human visages, their eyes glowing with an unnatural, predatory light in the darkness. They moved with a speed and agility that was impossible for their bulk, leaping over obstacles, scaling low rocks with ease. The hunters scrambled to defend their meager camp, fighting desperately against the unexpected onslaught. Einar, his voice sharp with command, directed their defense, calling out orders, his bow already drawn, sending arrows flying into the attacking forms. Bjorn, his massive spear braced against the ground, became a bulwark, using his immense strength to meet the charge. Attempting to channel the attacking creatures towards the limited openings in their makeshift barrier, hoping to funnel them into the paths where he might still be able to use his knowledge of traps and obstacles. The battle raged in the oppressive semi-darkness of the gorge, illuminated only by the dying embers of their fire and the pale light filtering from the distant sky. The sounds were a terrifying symphony of chaos. The guttural growls and roars of the creatures, the sharp clash of metal on bone and flesh, the ragged shouts and cries of the hunters. The air was thick with the foul odor of the creatures, mingling with the metallic tang of spilled blood and the acrid smoke of the fire. Each hunter fought with desperate ferocity, relying on instinct and training. Einar's arrows flew true, finding their marks but often only staggering the attackers. Stig, his usual analytical calm replaced by a desperate agility, weaved through the melee, his knife a blur, aiming for vital points with lightning-fast strikes. Kettle and Torsten, axes swinging, met the charge head-on, their blows powerful but often deflected by the thick hides and unnatural bone structure of their foes. A horrifying truth became rapidly apparent. Their conventional weapons were not delivering immediate killing blows. Arrows buried themselves in thick fur and muscle. Axes bit deep but were sometimes shrugged off by the creatures, which continued their assault with terrifying resilience. They possessed an unnatural fortitude, fighting on even with grievous wounds that would have instantly felled a bear or a man. Their claws, long and sharp, and their powerful jaws were devastating weapons, tearing through hide and armor with frightening ease. Soulwag, far from being a passive observer, was an active participant in the desperate struggle. She wielded a sharp, curved knife, but her primary weapons were her knowledge and her preparations. She hurled small pouches and clay balls filled with her concoctions at the attacking creatures. Substances that caused sudden pain, confusion, or temporary paralysis. She moved with a quiet purpose, identifying the creature's vulnerabilities, striking at points where the unnatural form was weakest. A battle fought with ancient knowledge against a perversion of nature. Catil, the weight of his earlier terror crushing him, froze for a dreadful moment in the initial onslaught. His face a mask of pure, paralyzing fear, making him an easy target. Then, with a guttural roar born of desperation and the last vestiges of his warrior pride, something snapped within him. He surged forward, shedding his fear in a burst of raw, unthinking rage, swinging his axe with brutal force, plunging headfirst into the thickest part of the fight. His fate, and the fate of the others, hung precariously in that moment of desperate, unbridled fury. The assault intensified, the creatures pressing their advantage with relentless focus. There were more of them than the hunters had initially estimated. A tide of fur and muscle and gnashing teeth pouring from the shadows. They attacked with a chilling coordination, attempting to flank the hunter's position, seeking to breach their fragile perimeter from multiple points simultaneously. Bjorn, the rock of their defense, was locked in a brutal struggle with one of the largest and most monstrous of the attacking forms. His immense physical strength met the raw power of the creature head-on. He jabbed with his spear, attempting to keep the beast at bay, trying to maneuver it towards the unseen traps he had laid outside the immediate camp. But the creature was too swift, too intelligent in its movements, anticipating his attempts to control its path. The struggle was savage and bloody, a brutal dance of muscle and force. In the end, despite his strength and skill, Bjorn was overwhelmed. He died fighting, his spear thrust deep into the creature's flank, torn apart by claws and teeth in a final desperate attempt to hold the line to buy his comrades time. Stig, abandoning his attempts at logical explanation, moved along the edges of the chaos, his eyes scanning the swirling melee. He used his agility and keen sight to assess the enemy's numbers, to identify potential weaknesses in their attack, to find a route, any route, that offered a chance for retreat or a decisive counterblow. He avoided direct, prolonged confrontation, his knife flashing out in quick, precise strikes when necessary, a witness to the brutal, horrifying moments unfolding around him. Then, in the very heart of the desperate struggle, as Kettle fought with the mindless fury of a cornered beast against a towering, wolf-headed figure, the ultimate, most horrific revelation occurred. The creature he faced, struck by a powerful blow from Kettle's axe that bit deep into its shoulder, staggered back, letting out a sound that was not a beast's roar, but a ragged, agonizing shriek. As the hunters watched, frozen for a dreadful moment by the sound, the creature began to change. The thick, matted fur rippled and receded, exposing skin beneath. Limbs twisted and contorted, bones shifting and grinding with sickening pops and cracks. The monstrous form deformed, shrinking, losing its defined bestial shape in a horrifying, liquid-like flux. This was no swift, magical transformation. This was a painful, agonizing unmaking, a violent shedding of one form for another, accompanied by sounds of torment that chilled the blood. And then, from within the collapsing, changing form, a face emerged. It was a human face, contorted by pain and etched with a look of profound, unspeakable madness, but it was recognizable. It was the face of one of the missing villagers, the farmer, the man whose name Helgi had spoken with such sorrow just days before. As the transformation continued, revealing more of the underlying human form trapped within the bestial shell, the creature emitted sounds that were horribly reminiscent of human speech, ragged whispers that were pleas or curses, or simply the babbling of a mind shattered by the horror it inhabited. A wave of profound shock rippled through the surviving hunters, momentarily paralyzing them. They had faced monsters, yes, but in that horrifying moment they understood. These were not simply creatures of evil, not born of the wild or some alien realm. They were people, twisted and trapped by a terrible curse. Their enemy was not a malevolent beast, but a tragic, mutilated entity, a victim of an unholy transformation. This realization, sudden and gut-wrenching, changed everything, casting the entire battle in a new, infinitely more terrifying light. The primal fear of being hunted by monsters was replaced by a deeper, more complex horror at the perversion of humanity, at the fate worse than death that had befallen the lost villagers. In the instant of shocked hesitation that followed this revelation, as Kettle stared, his warrior rage faltering at the recognizable face emerging from the dying creature before him, he received a terrible wound. One of the other attacking forms, sensing his momentary paralysis, lunged. It inflicted a deep, ragged bite and a raking tear with its massive claws on Kettle's arm and chest. The wound was instantly gruesome, bleeding profusely, but more than that, it looked wrong. It did not bleed cleanly. A dark, viscous fluid mingled with the blood. It did not begin to close or clot normally. And in that moment, A new, even more terrifying thought flashed through their minds, a fear far exceeding that of death in battle. The fear of contagion, of the curse being passed. Kettle's deepest, most irrational fears had materialized, not in the form of spirits or demons, but in the living, agonizing reality of a wound inflicted by a creature that was both man and beast. The horrifying revelation shattered the precarious cohesion of the surviving hunters. The shock of witnessing the transformation, of recognizing the faces of the lost villagers trapped within the monstrous forms, plunged them into chaos. Some stood frozen, unable to reconcile what they had seen with their understanding of reality. Others reeled back in despair, their will to fight evaporating. A few, like Kettle, reacted with a surge of raw, unreasoning terror and pain. Einar, though visibly shaken by the profound horror, remained the anchor. His gaze swept over the scene. The fallen forms of the creatures, the crumpled shape of Bjorn lying near the barricade, the injured Catil clutching his wound, the remaining creatures still circling, their forms shifting and uncertain in the gloom. He understood with a cold, decisive clarity that they could not win here. This valley was the source, the sanctuary, the heart of the curse. They had unveiled the terrible secret of the dire tribe, but they were not strong enough, not equipped to destroy its root. The priority now was survival, to escape this accursed place and carry the truth, however unspeakable, back to the world outside. He issued the command, his voice strained but firm. Retreat. Fall back. Now. The loss of Bjorn weighed heavily upon them, a silent, grim confirmation of the battle's cost. His death was not a warrior's glorious end, but a brutal, terrifying mauling by creatures that were both familiar and utterly alien. This knowledge made their grief a complex, agonizing thing, interwoven with the horror of his final moments. The surviving hunters, Einar, Stig, Soulwag, and Torsten, scrambled to disengage, attempting to break through the remaining attackers and escape the confines of the hidden valley. Stig, his tracker's instinct reasserting itself even in the chaos, identified a potential weak point in the creature's cordon, a path that offered a slim chance of egress. Soulwag, acting swiftly, hurled the last of her disruptive concoctions, creating a blinding, foul-smelling cloud that caused some of the nearest creatures to recoil in pain and confusion, momentarily distracting them and creating an opening. As they moved towards the escape route, they did not abandon their wounded comrade. Despite the delay and the increased vulnerability it presented, they moved to retrieve Catil, supporting him between them, his weight a dead burden as they struggled to make their way. It was an act born of instinct, of the ingrained code of camaraderie among those who faced death together, a refusal to leave one of their own, even as the chilling suspicion about the nature of his wound began to form in the back of their minds. The creatures pursued them, emerging from the shadows of their sanctuary, their guttural cries echoing off the rock walls. But the pursuit was less intense, less relentless than the initial attack. They were reluctant to venture too far from the valley's confines. Their power or their nature was somehow tied to this place. The pursuit slackened and finally ceased altogether as the hunters reached the narrow entrance to the gorge. Exhausted, bleeding, and profoundly shaken, the surviving hunters stumbled out of the hidden valley, back into the relative familiarity of the outer forest. The fresh air, though cold, felt strangely alien after the stagnant, deathly atmosphere of the lair. The sounds of the normal forest, the rustle of leaves, The distant calls of unfamiliar birds seemed unnaturally loud after the absolute silence of the gorge. The pursuit had ended, but the chilling sensation of being watched, of having awakened something ancient and terrible, lingered, clinging to them like the foul scent of the lair. They had escaped with their lives, but they carried the shadow of the valley within them. The journey back from the depths of the great woods was not a triumphant return, but a grim, arduous ordeal, a test of endurance for both body and mind. The hunters moved in a strained silence, each lost in the personal hell of their memories and the trauma they had endured. The physical exhaustion of the retreat combined with the psychic weight of the horror they had witnessed pressed down on them, every step a painful reminder of the abyss they had glimpsed. Their primary concern beyond their own aching bodies and shallow wounds was Catil. They tended to him as best they could on the long trail, stopping only when necessary to rest or for Soulwag to examine his wound. The bite and claw marks on his arm and chest looked bad. The flesh around them was unnaturally swollen and discolored, taking on a strange bruised hue that deepened to a morbid purple. The wound itself had a foul, unnatural odor, a metallic tang mixed with something else, something subtly sickening. Soulwag cleaned it with her herbal washes, applied poultices meant to draw out infection and promote healing, but she worked with a growing sense of dread. She felt with a chilling certainty that defied rational explanation, that this was not a normal wound inflicted by animal teeth and claws. Her remedies, effective against the venoms of snakes and the infections of earthly wounds, offered only limited relief, fighting against a corruption that was not merely physical. She watched Kettle constantly, her face etched with deep concern. The nights became a new form of torment. Sleep offered no escape, only a descent into nightmares fueled by the day's horrors. The familiar sounds of the forest, the sighing of the wind, the rustling of unseen creatures now seemed imbued with the spectral whispers and guttural growls of the valley. The hunters would wake in cold sweats, sometimes crying out, or startled by the low, ragged moans that escaped from the feverish Catil. Torsten, his face pale and hollow-eyed, had lost the last vestige of his youthful eagerness. He moved like a man twice his age, his gaze vacant, haunted by images that clung to the edges of his sight. As the days passed, subtle, terrifying signs appeared in Kettle, first barely noticeable, then increasingly apparent. His fever spiked suddenly, his skin burning to the touch, only to plummet hours later. He exhibited moments of unnatural strength when trying to shift position or push away a hand tending him. A brief surge of power that was out of proportion for a wounded man. His sense of smell was unnaturally heightened. He flinched or grew agitated at odors that were barely perceptible to the others. A disturbing, unnatural light occasionally flickered in his eyes, a predatory gleam that was utterly alien to the man they knew. He became restless and agitated at times, thrashing against his makeshift bindings, only to fall back into periods of unnaturally deep stupor. His breathing shallow and uneven. The surviving hunters noticed these changes, the subtle but terrifying shift in their comrade, but they spoke of them only in hushed whispers, afraid to give voice to the chilling implications. When they spoke, it was in low tones, when Kettle seemed to be in a deep sleep or stupor, recounting the horrors they had witnessed. They tried to articulate the unspeakable, to make sense of the transformation, the faces they had seen, the perversion of life in the hidden valley. They understood with a crushing finality that their victory had been nothing more than a desperate act of survival, a fleeting escape. The deer tribe was not vanquished. Its terrible secret was revealed, but its power remained, its curse a tangible, terrifying force. The grief for Bjorn mingled with the horror of his death. He had been a man of immense strength and loyalty, a vital part of their group. His loss was a gaping wound, compounded by the knowledge that he had not fallen in clean combat, but had been torn apart by creatures that were both human and monstrous. This truth made the pain of his passing sharper, more agonizing, a constant reminder of the unnatural horror they had faced. Finally, after days that stretched into an eternity, they began to recognize signs of their proximity to the settled lands. The forest thinned slightly, allowing more light to penetrate. They recognized familiar ridges, the course of a stream that flowed towards the sea, the distant profile of a hill near the village. A faint sense of relief, cold and hesitant, washed over them, quickly overshadowed by a profound sense of foreboding. They were returning, yes, but they were not returning whole. They carried not only their physical wounds and psychological scars, but the terrifying knowledge of what they had faced, and the chilling suspicion of what was happening to Kettle. They did not know how they could tell the truth, how the villagers would react, or what fate awaited their wounded comrade. They were returning from the shadow, but the shadow had followed them. The surviving hunters, Einar, Stig, Soulwag, and Torsten, emerged from the fringe of the great woods and walked, weary and gaunt, into the village. The sight of them brought a wave of profound relief and surging emotion from the waiting inhabitants. The villagers rushed forward, their faces etched with worry that dissolved into cries of welcome. They were embraced, hailed as heroes who had ventured into the forbidden depths and returned. Food and drink were pressed upon them, questions poured forth, a torrent of anxious inquiry mixed with desperate hope. They were survivors, and in the eyes of the villagers, they had vanquished the unspeakable terror. But the hunters did not share in the villagers' joyous relief. Their faces, though marked by fatigue and the grime of the journey, held a deeper, more profound shadow. Their eyes, having seen the unspeakable, looked out upon the familiar world with a chilling detachment, a weariness that went beyond mere exhaustion. Their silence, initially attributed to the shock of their ordeal, stretched into an unsettling reluctance to fully recount the tale. They spoke of a terrible beast, of a hard fight, of the loss of Bjorn and the wounding of Catil, but they omitted the details that mattered most: the sudden disappearance of the tracks, the unsettling discoveries in the hidden valley, the nature of the lair, and the ultimate soul-shattering horror of the transformation they had witnessed, the human faces emerging from the monstrous forms. Their incomplete, fragmented account felt strange to the villagers, whose initial joy was now tempered by a vague unease, but they attributed it to the lingering trauma of their experience. Catil, the wounded comrade, was carried into the village and gently laid upon a clean mat. Soulwag, her face grim and watchful, continued to tend to his wounds, cleaning them, applying her dwindling supply of poultices. But her ministrations were performed with a palpable sense of anxiety. She watched the wounds closely, seeing how they resisted normal healing, how the discolored flesh pulsed faintly with an unnatural life. And she watched Kettle. His eyes, when open, held that disturbing predatory gleam. His low moans and ragged breathing were interspersed with guttural sounds that were not human. He thrashed and struggled with a strength that was impossible for his weakened state. He sometimes snarled or whimpered in his fevered sleep. Soulwag, combining her observation of the wound's unnatural corruption and the increasingly disturbing changes in Kettle's behavior with her deep knowledge of ancient lore and the symbols she had seen in the hidden valley, reached a terrible, undeniable conclusion. The wound was more than just physical trauma. It was a vector, a point of entry for the curse. Kettle was infected. The dark magic, the unholy corruption that bound the dire tribe, had passed into him. He was beginning to transform. In the culmination of the return, the chilling truth became impossible to deny. As Kettle lay restless, surrounded by the quiet solicitude of the villagers and the watchful eyes of the surviving hunters, the signs became overtly, horrifyingly clear. His muscles convulsed violently. His bones shifted beneath his skin with a sickening series of pops and grinding sounds. Patches of dark, coarse hair erupted on his skin, spreading like a vile moss. His eyes glowed with an unnatural, bestial fire, fixed and predatory. He let out a low, guttural growl that was utterly inhuman. Soulwag, her voice low but carrying the weight of a final, chilling pronouncement, spoke to the other survivors. "He is changing," she said, the words heavy with despair. "The curse. It is upon him. He is becoming one of them." The horror of the dire tribe was no longer confined to the forbidden depths of the great woods. It had followed them back. It lived now, festering and growing, within one of their own, a comrade, a friend. The surviving hunters looked upon Kettle's contorting form, upon Soulwag's face etched with certainty, upon each other, and they understood. Their return had not brought safety or closure. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter of the nightmare. There was no catharsis, no triumphant victory. The dire tribe remained, its secret laid bare but its power untouched in its hidden sanctuary. The survivors were forever marked, forever bound to the horror they had encountered. Their lives, and the lives of those they had returned to, would never be the same. They had brought the shadow back with them, and the ancient fear of the shadow in the fjord woods had now become the chilling, ever-present dread of the shadow within their own hearts, and in the very homes they had sought to protect.